Let me begin what I have to say today with a tape from NPR, the government-funded socialist news agency. This is their show, NPR Politics, and they're interviewing their justice correspondent, Carrie Johnson, about Mueller's letter complaining about Barr's summary about a report that has now been released in its full 400-page glory.
Okay, so Carrie, let me make sure I have the timeline of this all right, because there's a lot of letters involved, and apparently more letters coming soon. Okay, so we have William Barr sends his 4-page letter to Congress that becomes public saying, here's what Robert Mueller found. Robert Mueller doesn't like that. He writes his own private letter to William Barr. After he sends that letter and Barr presumably reads that letter, Barr goes to Congress and says, I don't know of any concerns, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So March 24th, a date that will live in my brain in infamy, Sunday, remember, Barr sends this 4-page letter to Congress.
So a date that will live in infamy, you will remember, that is how FDR described Pearl Harbor, where something like 2,500 Americans died after a sneak attack by the Japanese. That is the term that she uses to describe this summary that Barr sent out about a report he didn't even have to release to the public to tell people what's in the report. No collusion. Trump was not colluding with the Russians, and Mueller had declined to say whether he should be charged with obstruction of justice, but Barr said no. This lives in infamy. Why? Well, the New York Times told us why, that the Democrats, the left, the media, but I repeat myself, they were worried that this took over the narrative. It put forward, it got the narrative out that Trump was innocent and this thing was a complete hoax. This Russian collusion thing was a complete hoax, which it essentially was. It got it out there before the New York Times and before NPR and before the networks and CNN and the rest had a chance to skew the narrative that way. That's why they've been working overtime at doing this. Right now, they are talking in the House about holding Barr in contempt of Congress because he doesn't want to show up for a hearing in which he will be questioned as no other attorney general, in a form that no other attorney general has ever been questioned in. They will have lawyers just pounding him with questions for like 30 minutes. And he said, no, I agreed to talk to the House. You're the elected people. You should know what you're doing. You should be able to question me. So this massive effort has come to get the narrative back, because that's what they care about. Not the economy, not the fact that the poorest people, the people who were forgotten, the people that Obama said would never have jobs again, not the fact that they have not only have jobs again, but that their wages are rising faster than rich people's wages. I mean, not any of that. That's not the news. Not the fact that, oh, look, Venezuela is falling apart. Why is that? What happened there? Not the fact that Israel once again under attack, and we'll talk about that too, but we're not talking about any of that. We're talking about the fact that Mueller was grumpy because it wasn't negative. What Barr said wasn't negative enough. And that grumpiness reflects the general grumpiness of the press that Donald Trump was not only found innocent, but now the attention is turning to how this stupid thing got started. And look, if I had to guess, I can't prove this, but if I had to guess, this entire thing was a panicky way of covering up what the FBI did, which never would have come to light. Never would have come to light if Hillary Clinton had won. So here's the thing about this, right? All they care about is this narrative. Barton Swain in the Wall Street Journal, he writes about political books for the Journal. He responded to James Comey's incredible, sanctimonious, self-serving op-ed in the New York Times. He wrote this op-ed saying, oh, Barr, his soul is being eaten by Donald Trump because Donald Trump is so corrupt, he eats your soul, but he couldn't eat my soul because my soul is shrouded in a sort of wonderful halo, a shielding halo of sanctimony and self-righteousness. So Donald Trump couldn't touch my soul, but Barr's soul is being eaten away because he took control of this narrative when it's our job to control the narrative. And Swain says, that in this op-ed, Comey never has to prove any of the points he makes. And the reason is he's writing for the New York Times, where it's all taken as given. And he says, Mr. Comey's op-ed nicely captures what ails present-day American liberalism, by which he means leftism, because there's nothing liberal about it. He says its defining characteristic is a labored ignorance of the other side. Liberals frequently neither know nor care what non-liberals think. Their own views predominate in the universities and media. Why bother considering lesser ones. Liberals take the other side seriously, mainly when it has the bad manners to win an election and hold power. Conservatives have no such luxury. However angular and ignorant a right-of-center commentator may be, he can't ignore liberal opinions. He says, turn your radio dial back and forth between NPR and talk radio. On NPR, references to conservatives and conservatism are few and awkward. The word conservative, and this is really important, he says the word conservative often attaches to people very few conservatives recognize as ideological associates, from centrist liberals like David Brooks to eccentric figures like Steve Bannon. This is why Ben is always being called alt-right. They have no idea that Ben hates the alt-right, that he stands opposed to the alt-right. They just think, well, he's somewhere over there in that dark corner. This is the thing. They don't listen because they think there's only one opinion, and this is why they can keep saying this. And that's why they don't see themselves. They don't see what they look like to the rest of us. They don't hear and they don't report the news. Now, I just want to finish talking about some of this. I don't want to get into the deep weeds about the FBI did this and the FBI did that, but just about the way it's being reported. You only have to think about the fact that if George W. Bush had sent the FBI to spy on Obama's campaign, we would not be discussing the meaning of spying. But now we've got the New York Times finally publishing leaked FBI stuff, because the FBI knows that the Inspector General Michael Horowitz's report is coming out. They know it's coming out, and they want to get ahead of it by going to friendly people. The New York Times, who now represents federal law enforcement spying on opposition campaigns. That's what the New York Times now stands for, right? They don't stand for reporting the news. They don't stand for defending the Constitution. They stand for guys like Obama using the FBI to spy on opposition campaigns. That's what the FBI represents, okay? So they now admit, because it's been leaked to them, FBI sent investigator posing as assistant to meet with Trump aide in 2016. This is George Papadopoulos. They sent a woman whose name was, she had some interesting code name, Azra Turk. They sent her to ask Papadopoulos, was the Trump campaign working with Russia? So even on MSNBC, one of the guys who wrote this report, Michael Schmidt, goes on MSNBC, and Willie Geist unbelievably asks him the $64,000 question.
Let me start with the central question on a lot of people's minds last night as they first read it and as they read it this morning. How is this not spying?
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of spying. The Attorney General sort of saying the other day that he has an expansive view of spying, including legal spying, in the way that if the government actually has the right to be doing it, that spying is not illegal. Others have a different connotation of it and see it more nefariously. What this was the FBI felt that it needed to have eyes and ears on the ground as it used a confidential informant to speak to two Trump campaign officials. And what they did is they installed a woman with this professor in England who made these attempts to talk to these individuals, and the woman herself spoke to at least one of them. What this showed to us was sort of how seriously the FBI was taking the problem.
Who cares how seriously the FBI is taking the problem now that we know that they were wrong in every respect? Not only did Trump not collude with the Russians, but George Papadopoulos had no notion that anything was going on. The premise is that Papadopoulos knew that the Russians had hacked these emails, which turns out not to be true. And the only person who had talked to him about this was a guy named Mefsud, a professor who the Mueller report tries to show as a Russian spy, but in fact was a guy who had only worked with our intelligence agencies. That's all he had worked with. So obviously there's some suspicion that the information was planted on Papadopoulos to give them an excuse to spy on this campaign. Look, I don't know what happened. It may have been an innocent mistake in some ways, in the sense that they panicked. But the fact that the idea that a sanctimonious buffoon like James Comey thought the FBI could properly be used to spy on a Republican campaign under the Obama administration tells you everything you need to know about the Obama administration, but also everything you need to know about the New York Times, a former newspaper, now the defender of government interference in elections through federal law enforcement agencies. So the press is gone. I mean, we can't be shocked about this every time we hear about it. The press is gone, and it doesn't just happen in these stories that are happening. It happens in a much broader sense. I'll get to